Welcome to the Inspire Health Podcast. Your life is about to get a whole lot better. Have you ever felt like you tried everything and yet still couldn't find the answers or the solutions that you were seeking? Whether you're dealing with chronic illness, physical or emotional pain, I want you to know that your body is the most sophisticated machine on planet Earth. Your body holds unfathomable wisdom. Trust in it and learn from it. Know that there are answers and there are solutions to your specific health challenges. And we will be uncovering all of them here on the Inspire Health Podcast. I'm so excited to be a part of your healing journey. Your transformation starts now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Inspire Health Podcast. Today's guest is Trina Altman. Trina is the creator of Yoga Deconstructed and Pilates Deconstructed. These programs take an interdisciplinary approach to foster an embodied understanding of yoga and Pilates and the relationship to modern movement science. Trina's presented at Kripalu, the Yoga Alliance Leadership Conference, and Yoga Works, among many others, and her work has been published in the Yoga Journal, Yoga International, and Pilates Style. Her new book, Yoga Deconstructed, Transitioning from Rehabilitation Back into the Yoga Studio, is slated to be published by Handspring Publishing at some point in 2020. Trina also works out of Equinox and Cara in Los Angeles. And for more information on Trina and her online classes and courses, you can visit trinaaltman.com and you can follow her on Instagram or Facebook. And we'll put all of that information in the show notes at the end. Trina, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I was looking forward to talking to you. I was just saying we did a section where I was just talking to Hallie Schwartz and we were breaking down the whole philosophy and yoga philosophy. And now I wanted to talk to you because you have a much stronger sort of biomechanical aspect of yoga practice that I think is a really important piece for a lot of people to hear. So first off, Trina, what came first, yoga, Pilates? How did you decide to marry these two together?
Yoga came first. So I did my 200-hour teacher training back in 2007. And then my 300-hour, I started in 2008 and finished it in 2009. But I was simultaneously starting a Pilates training. I think I did must have been 2009 to 2010 was when I did my Pilates training. And the Pilates just kind of happened by chance. I always wanted to do Pilates on the apparatus, but it's expensive. And I ended up teaching yoga in Iowa City, where we were living at a studio that had both yoga and Pilates. And so I got a nice discount on, taking reformer classes.
Yeah.
And so the woman who owned the studio said, I'm going to need to go on maternity leave. If you take this training and pass the test, can you cover for me on maternity leave? And I thought, yeah, I'll get to practice in the studio. I'm a nerd, so I'm the happiest when I'm learning. And so yeah, it was another excuse to learn more stuff and, take more trainings. But it really filled in gaps for me. I'm hypermobile, so it was really helpful to have the contrast of Pilates, which focuses more on controlling your ranges of motion, stability and strength in your end ranges of motion, versus yoga, which tends to be physically at least more about stretching.
Well, and it sounds like then what sort of came out of that combination that that motivated you to write this new book on Yoga Deconstructed and even the term deconstructed, how does that all fit in?
Yeah. Well, I think with both yoga and Pilates, a lot of people are drawn to them. Just like we're drawn to any movement modality, we see the fancy, cool stuff and we want to do it, because that's usually what it is, the picture or the video. And when I started teaching, I remember I was teaching actually reformer classes, and the teacher would, basically had everybody doing, like a set Pilates reformer sequence that was pretty beginner level. beginner to intermediate. And she's like, I can't introduce any of the more advanced exercises because none of these students are taking private sessions, and it's just too, risky. And I remember she said, for your training, you could do, you have to teach a whole bunch of hours for free for your training. Why don't you teach them some of the more challenging exercises so that I can start teaching them in the classes? And so it became sort of a collaboration. And what I discovered, so long ago when teaching those free privates was, it wasn't just teaching them the hard exercise. It was teaching them all the component parts of the challenging exercise, and how those parts related to the exercise that they wanted to do that required, say, more strength or more flexibility. And I found the same thing, to be happening with yoga as well. For both Pilates and yoga, they tend to live somewhat in what I call the post-rehab zone. So, you've gone to physical therapy, but you're not ready to go to the gym and take HIIT classes or go to CrossFit. And so the doctor says, or the PT says, why don't you start in yoga or Pilates? And so I've always enjoyed like critical thinking, problem solving, and I hope I'm not going off on a tangent, but I
No,
would
that's good.
say that what I love the most about Pilates, among many things, was people take private Pilates sessions, just like they take private personal training sessions, whereas in yoga, it's not so much a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to work with people one-on-one, using all the different pieces of equipment. So, the reformer, the Cadillac, the Wunda chair, the ladder barrel, the spine corrector, the arc barrel, all these different pieces of equipment that had external load and, provided them with closed chain feedback was really, really useful, and worked well, I would say, in contrast to what I call the experience of a group class, right? And a group class is a group class. It can't ever be tailored to an individual, because everyone's different.
Mm-hmm.
So in a group class, the standard way of teaching, from what I learned in my 200 and 300 hour, was more of, like, here's the sequence. Maybe if you're lucky, the studio has beginner classes, intermediate classes, but most of the time it's like people just come whenever the time works for them and don't even necessarily look to see if it's beginner or intermediate. So I think the contrast of Pilates gave me a really good perspective, because at least back then, it's changed now. You were not allowed to take group classes at a Pilates studio unless you had taken a certain number of privates and the teacher approved you for a group class. And so I just got a whole different way of looking at how we learn about movement that wasn't
Mm-hmm.
cookie cutter, that wasn't one size fits all, because every client that I was working with was different. And so I knew from day one, you could never keep everyone safe in a group class, because one person's poison is another person's, perfect exercise.
Yeah, so true.
Yeah.
And I remember when I first started doing yoga, probably over a decade ago, and I remember going to the first class, and I remember kind of watching as I was experiencing it for the first time, and from my background as an osteopath and a registered massage therapist stuff from before, I remember looking around and thinking,
Yeah.
I'm not totally understanding how that's not jamming their facet joints, or how that's not creating some shoulder problems, or and
Right.
then eventually I did my yoga teacher training, and I found out, no, that people are jamming their
Yeah.
facet joints. They are irritating their shoulder, because so many people need fine tunements around those things. So like you said, in a group class, it's impossible for the instructor to make sure that everybody is got it all dialed in. Even when they know well and they know how to make proper adjustments, it's just hard to do it all, and everybody's needs are very individual. So
Yes.
so by looking at by incorporating the Pilates and some of the different work that you did, what did you start to find was missing in the yoga scene? What did you need to start to bring to it?
Well, I think first and most importantly was a new dialogue. So the dialogue in my teacher training and just sort of the culture around yoga was, and I'm hoping it's changing, that I'm not just living in this little bubble, but that yoga is all you need. Yoga is a complete practice. And you should just do your practice every day, and that's all you need. And I think, my 200 hour was completely transformative. The practice that was our homework to do every day was Ayurveda practices like dry brushing and, massage with oil and meditation practice and pranayama and maybe some asana if we felt like it. Um, but what happens is our society is so sedentary, and if there's just the slightest amount of movement in yoga, which there is, it's the asana portion, then people feel like they have permission. Oh, well, I'm doing my yoga practice, that's the only exercise or movement that I need. And then the folks who are just doing yoga, or even teachers of yoga who maybe haven't studied other types of movement, pass along this sort of misinformation of if it hurts, just stretch it, it'll get better. Keep doing this pose. If you just keep doing the pose, you'll get better at the pose, and eventually you'll get it, without telling the truth of cross training. And that no matter how wonderful any specific type of movement is, in isolation it's not wonderful.
Well, and I think that's where you find for a lot of people that the concept of these repetitive motion induced injuries can start to happen over time with yoga. Is that something that you've seen a lot that made you start to look at how to integrate these different movements?
Yeah, the beginning of the journey was learning what I did in my Pilates comprehensive training about stability and some kinesiology and biomechanics, and then looking around the room when I was teaching a flow class, because that was the most popular type of yoga. It still is. And saying, oh, yeah, like this over time might not be so good. And I think there's language is changing around, with nocibic language, like moving away from the term repetitive stress injury and reframing it as just not readiness to load yet. So I know students who are like, my shoulder feels great when I'm doing, plank, but any other position it hurts. And it's like, well, yeah, because you're only training your shoulder to do one thing, and that's support you in plank. So you'll be really good at that. But any other loads, like, should say, well, if I reach my arm out to the side, it's like, yeah, that's too long of a lever, even though there's no dumbbell in your hand.
Yeah.
So yeah, the specificity, the said principle, and progressive loading need to be in place. So I think, yeah, the RSI term is true, but if we can, I don't know, and the wear and tear, like all this terminology that we know can be sort of nocibic and with what we know about pain science, not so helpful. But educating our students about, no, it's not that your joints are wearing out, it's that you haven't done the prerequisites to do the thing that you're doing all the time. So it's like, if you can't do a regular push-up, you're definitely it's very unlikely that you'll be able to do chaturanga because it's harder than a regular push-up.
Yeah. No, I think
Yeah.
those are really good points. And because you do see injuries develop. I even know for myself when I was doing certain movements over and over again, because it sometimes does become your main sort of focus. Sometimes depending on how much time you've got to dedicate towards exercise, yoga kind of becomes it,
Yeah.
or people go to the gym, or people, the cross training is not quite so common anymore. And I
Yes.
think yoga is depicted as a whole practice, which maybe in some ways it can be, but I definitely think for the injuries that you start to see, I like it being broken down that it's whether or not your body is ready to do those types of movements anymore, or how do you build enough resilience up or build the body up so that it now can do certain movements effectively. And the tricky part with yoga, I think you had mentioned once in an article, is that yoga is all body weight. So
Yeah,
you can't really do these smaller increments to build up strength. You're basically either, for the most part, managing your body weight or not. You can't sort of do
right.
little bits at a time. Is that something that
Exactly.
you found really beneficial with the process of adding in some kind of weights and what that might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, we're very logical in certain areas of our lives. Say with food, it's common knowledge that, you know, you wouldn't just eat, um, you know, broccoli for breakfast, lunch, and dinner and nothing else, even though broccoli is good for you. You would start to have some nutritional deficiencies, and you might not feel so great. But we show up to a yoga class, we've never loaded our wrists in our entire life, unless maybe you happen to be a gymnast in your
Mhm.
youth. And even still, that was in your youth. And then you're loading your wrists for hour and 15 minutes. And not just like in a hands and knees position, but, you know, hands and knees, plank, down dog, maybe a crow pose at the end, you know, chaturangas. And so that logic doesn't transfer in the same way. I think things are changing, you know, and the information is getting out there slowly,
Mhm.
but the challenge is also the business models that are out there. So, you know, if you own a yoga studio, you're going to run a special that's like, you know, 30 days for $30, do yoga every day. It's a really good deal. You know, and not just, I'm not just picking on yoga, our bar, you know, bar
Yeah.
studio or CrossFit, whatever the type of movement is. I mean, even in more gentler practices like Feldenkrais, where, you know, it's like Feldenkrais is amazing for you, but you're not getting you're not doing anything for your heart cardiovascularly, right? You're not, there's all the things that you're not doing. So it's that same analogy of like, well, Feldenkrais might be like broccoli, but you need more than broccoli.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think it's inherent to even look at what are some of the tendencies in certain practices. So I
Mm-hmm.
love yoga, but at the same
Yes.
point, I remember one of my instructors saying at one point, you know, yogis have great triceps, but they don't have a whole lot of biceps. So
Yeah.
maybe you can deconstruct that a little bit as far as strengthening and push and pull in the movement.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think pulling is essential for everybody, because it's it just doesn't really exist in our daily life. I mean, there's not a whole lot of pushing either, but occasionally you're pushing a grocery cart or you're pushing a heavy door. You know, you used to have to push. I still have like a 10-year-old Subaru. I still have to push the trunk thing down. I know when I get a new
Yeah.
one, it's gonna have a button, but
Or a
but
baby
yeah.
carriage. That's a big one.
Yeah, but there isn't really any pulling in our daily life, and there's definitely not any pulling in yoga. And so, yes, if you then end up biasing where all you're doing is pushing, and also pushing loads that you haven't prepared yourself for incrementally over time, or balanced it out with any sort of pulling, then yeah, it's pretty likely you're going to end up with some sort of situation. I mean, I think the standard is, you know, push, pull, squat, and jump, right? You need your plyometrics, your, you know, pushing, pulling, weight lifting, squatting. Not that, again, that's everything either, but it's more well-rounded, than, say, if you're a runner and all you do is run on concrete, you know,
Hmm.
however many miles, 4 days a week or five, and then you wonder why you're injured.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and speaking of injuries, I find sometimes you'll see these dichotomies in yoga too. You'll see these sort of groups where it might be the person that is overly stiff and that
Yes.
ultimately needs more mobility and stretch. And then you'll see the other group that's drawn to yoga that is hypermobile and they actually
Yes.
need more stability and strength. So, how do you navigate
Yes.
that in a class?
Right. That's a great question. So when I teach my group classes, first of all, I teach at a gym. So it's great because, students can walk in and I can say, hey, this is what we're going to do in my class. This isn't all you need. You also need to go downstairs and lift some weights and do some cardio, maybe even take a Zumba class for some motor control, coordination, brain health. But in my classes, I'll structure it in several different ways. So sometimes I'll structure my class with a peak pose, which is actually pretty traditional in the yoga world. But in the yoga world, generally the progression is you do a whole bunch of poses to warm up for the peak pose or the harder pose. Whereas I prefer to take a pose and say, okay, what type of range of motion is required in the wrists, what type of range of motion is required in the shoulder, what type of range of motion is, at each joint, and then also load. So, if you're doing, say, wheel pose, which is a back bend, that's a completely different amount of load than bow pose, which is the same shape, but a different orientation to gravity. So you wouldn't just say generically, oh, we're going to do these poses to prep you for back bends, and it doesn't matter which back bend, because wheel pose is like you're loading up, your shoulders and your wrist, whereas in bow pose, where you're lying on your belly and you're grabbing your ankles, there's no load in your wrists. And so thinking about it from that perspective, and also just a broader perspective of, a back bend is a lot of spinal extension, but that doesn't mean you need to do all spinal extension to warm up for it. In fact, like the best thing you could do probably at the very beginning of class would be some thoracic rotation to warm up for the spinal extension, some side bending, some flexion. I'm a big fan of move all your parts in all the ways frequently. So what I'll do is I often start my class off with some sort of short Feldenkrais or Hanna-Somatic sequence that relates to the directions of motion that are going to be required later on in the class. So say it is like a back bend oriented class. And so we might do the Hanna-Somatic sequence where you're lying on your belly, prone in crocodile pose. And first you're just lifting and lowering your head. And then, say if your right hand is on top, you would lift and lower your right elbow. And then after that, you would lift your head and your arm. Then after that, add some rotation. But all this is done slowly without any sort of, the cues are like, how can you make this easier? How can you make this more efficient? What other parts of your body could you relax or, invite to the party to make it easier?
Right.
So it's less structured before moving on to, say, then maybe some mobility drills that are more like, okay, now we're going to irradiate. We're going to, squeeze a couple of tennis balls, tense everywhere in our body, and notice how you'll probably have more range of motion when you create this global tension than you would without it. But our nervous system is now upregulated, whereas in the Hanna-Somatics, our nervous system was downregulated. And then, transitioning from, say, some of those mobility drills into adding some external load. So rather than just the only load being, full or half of your body weight on your wrists and your shoulders, I bring resistance bands to class. So say we do some rotator cuff stuff with the resistance bands, or the studio where I teach my yoga classes at Equinox, there's also bar classes in there. So there's little hand weights. We have bricks that are pretty heavy. So, do some mobility drills, or just, say bird dogs with weights as opposed to unloaded. So there's some sort of progressive loading. It's not going to be ideal like it would be in a gym setting where you have endless equipment, but just so there's an understanding of, we don't go from 0 to 100, that there are steps in between along the way.
And you're sort of segmentally, even the different body parts and everything, to prep for the next position. And so if someone was on the hypermobile side,
yes,
and they have a tendency to fall into their joints and create even more strain on their ligaments or or connective tissue in the joint. What would be, how would you cue them? What would you do to try and get them to create more stability per se? How would you tweak that?
Um, yeah, I mean, I would say most of what I teach in my yoga classes is all active range of motion. So all the stuff that people who are hypermobile are good at, which includes me, I don't really teach. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, for example, everything is somewhat of a self-assessment. So it's like, you know, if you're wobbling going from crescent lunge to warrior three, right? Well, of course, that makes perfect sense. Like I shouldn't say nobody, but I was horrible at that transition until I started doing single leg RDLs at the gym with some weights and bending my knees, both of them in warrior three, rather than having them both straight, because then your
Mhm.
body has to actually, you know, kind of titrate and engage. Whereas, you know, if you're in warrior three, it's like all, you know, straight elbows, straight knees, your pelvis is like, what is going on? You know, there's no place to go. So I teach a lot of these balancing poses where, say, in half moon, you don't put your hand on the block, right? You try to balance, you know, in
Mhm.
space. I teach a class called Best Stretch Ever with, I don't know if you're familiar there, it's called stick mobility.
No,
And
I
it's a
read that in your bio though, but yeah, tell me about that.
Yeah, so there's all different lengths of sticks. So there's 7 foot, 6 foot, there's some shorter ones, and they actually bend. And if I were to describe it, I would say are you familiar with FRC and functional range conditioning, and Dr.
Mhm.
Andrea Spina? It's basically FRC with a stick, which is great because in FRC, you're asking people to make fists and tents everywhere in their body. Whereas with the stick mobility, you know, say we're in like gate pose or parigasana, which is you're kneeling with, say, your right knee, your left leg is out to the side, and then you have the stick in front of you. Um, and I just did this yesterday, and we were doing some hinging. So, like, you know, sitting back, your sits bones towards your heels and coming up. And then I actually had them hold onto the stick and try to hover their bottom knee,
Mm.
because I noticed people weren't like really using the stick in the way that you know, the class is about grip strength in a large part, and irradiation. Or when I teach triangle pose in that class, you know, we'll get into triangle pose. We have this stick kind of, you know, going from the top hand to the bottom hand. So your bottom hand is kind of where the block would normally be. And then I make them hover the stick off the ground. So it's sort of like an isometric version of a kettlebell windmill.
Yeah.
Or we'll do kettlebell windmills, but I'll call it triangle pose, and I'll have them holding, you know, like a block or some dumbbells or even a stretchy band. So I make most of the ranges of motion active. And then at the end, we do some nice passive stretching, or we might do some passive stretching in between all those, you know, challenging active
Yeah.
ranges of motion, just to calm the nervous system down. I teach a lot of rolling patterns as well and developmental kinesiology. So I incorporate a lot of Laban, Bartenieff, DNS, dynamic neuromuscular stabilization stuff. And then I just relate it all back to the yoga, because I find that, you know, a lot of what is traditional asana, so to speak, I was a gymnast. So when I first came to yoga, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. You know, like this is all the stuff I did. You know, I did a lot of acrobatics and tumbling. I was a competitive cheerleader. So the shapes were all very familiar to me. I felt no stretch in any of them. So I never came to yoga with this sort of, with any pose goals, because I never you know, it was just like I could make any shape and not really feel much
Mhm.
stretch. And even like the headstands and the handstands I had done as a gymnast, I wasn't super strong, but like it was in my body, mind, just from doing it since I was 3 years old. So yeah, so I think I might be going on a tangent, but yoga asana for me was never about really achieving the physical part. It was all about community. It was like the first time in my life that my 200 hour that I was with a group of people that weren't competing with each other, that were like just there because, you know, I come from a pretty like, you know, I went to like Ivy League school, I worked on Wall Street, you know, just all the sort of type A American competitive, like external validation type of background, you know, grew up in the 80s, materialism, all that.
Yeah.
So yoga for me was more of that. And so I think when I teach, that comes across. Like there isn't this, we're just there to play, we're there to explore, we're there to figure stuff out. We're there to challenge ourselves, we're there to relax.
Nice.
So.
Well, which I think everybody in Western world needs a little more of anyways. So.
Yeah, and that is the wonderful thing about yoga is it's like, yeah, if you really want to learn how to like nail that handstand, there are like thousands of online, you know, workshops and trainings and teachers that can, you know, teach you that.
Yeah.
It's nice that I think there's room for all of us to teach whatever part of yoga we
Oh
are
yeah,
most.
and it's all still fun. But when you find from doing it over the years, what have you found are some of the most the main common injuries that you see most frequently?
Well, you know, it's funny. I think that the injuries are all under they're injuries of not people not loading. Um, Basically, once I started doing enough strength training and enough Pilates on the apparatus, um, I no longer or having getting any sort of injuries from the yoga practice. So I don't like to say so much that like these yoga poses are injurious,
Hmm.
or you know, I don't think there's really, you know, it's the same as any other sport. So it's like the injuries you're going to get if you only run are the injuries you're going to, you know, Achilles or whatever.
Right.
So yoga is no different, but you wouldn't get those running injuries possibly, right, if you did other things besides run.
Nice. So
Think oh, I don't know if I'm answering your question well, but most of the people I know who, you know, get injured doing yoga, it's because they're only doing yoga. They've become somewhat obsessive about doing yoga because either you're in a teacher training and it's part of the homework, or you're, you know, you want to teach the best classes and so you're studying it all the time, or it's become an addiction, you know,
mhm,
a way of self-soothing, just like any other type of movement can be, you know, people who are addicted to cardio or people who are addicted to strength training. So yeah, I guess I would say, yeah, the injuries in yoga are probably the same as the injuries in gymnastics because, you know, to a certain extent, I don't like to, I used to say like, oh yes, you know, these are all the yoga injuries, but I've kind of moved away from that because, um, I don't know, just a lot of wanting to change the conversation
mhm.
about, right, like downward dog is probably fine if you do some overhead presses and you have that range of motion to do an overhead press and you're overhead pressing, you know, like, do you know what I mean, or like,
Yeah, no,
yeah,
I think the main point on it is that um, it's not that there's anything necessarily bad with yoga per se. It's more just create balance and look to see if something's getting out of
yes,
balance. That usually means then you need to be working on another piece to create more balance so then you can keep doing different movements. I mean, people can get injured from, you know, playing hockey once a week when they're not doing a whole lot of other things, and they come in
right,
with back pains, where if they were balancing that out and doing other things to make sure that the whole body functioned well together, then they'd probably have no problems with it. So I think I think generally the key point is it's that if you are getting injuries, then it usually means you need to take a deeper self-assessment to see where do you need to start to support so that your body's not getting injured so easily.
right. I mean, and I think the probably highest percentage of the population that's injured are the ones who don't move at all.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like they said,
right?
sitting's the next
Well,
smoking.
so it's like, so then how do we say like, right, yeah, yeah. It's, and I think knowing who you are. So I took a continuing education, like 2-day training with Dr. Robert Schleip. And he talked about how, obviously it's never, just black and white, but he talked about how people can be more of where their fascia is like Indian temple dancer fascia, right? They're very mobile. They can do all of the,
Yeah.
the movements. And then there's more of, he was saying like, your ancestors or you inherited more Viking fascia, right? So you can like push the iceberg across the sea, but you could never be and so I think, if you're a Viking, you might be fine doing a ton of yoga and not as much strength training. Whereas if you're like me and you're hypermobile, like I have to earn the right to do yoga because I did my whatever 2 days that week of strength training.
Well said. That's comes right back down to the individuality of the person, which is
Mm-hmm.
probably why sometimes when when you're able to do individualized classes, it really does help because you can get someone to really take a look at it. Well, from an asana perspective, then, what would be some of the things that you'd love to see change in the future for asana? What would be some things that you might think about adding in to balance the practice out a little bit more? And this might even be things that people can do outside of their group class, but that they might do to balance it out on their own time.
Right. Um, yeah, I would say, again, this I think can be changed by what yoga teachers say when they teach. So that it's not necessarily that you need to teach the way I teach, where I maybe teach less asana and more other types of movements in my yoga class.
Mhm.
You could just teach asana, but also make sure you get across to your students that asana isn't all they need, because I think that's the main problem.
Mhm.
And I think what's happened is, um, you know, the yoga that we've inherited in the West is the yoga of Krishnamacharya. Krishnamacharya had, 3 main students: Deskachar, Iyengar, and Patabi Joyce. And Patabi Joyce, the mantra was practice and all is coming, so everyone was told just do your practice. That's all you need. And that's where Vinyasa flow came from, which is the most popular style of yoga in the West. And then, same thing with Iyengar. Iyengar was touted as, therapeutic. He would teach classes that, you know, there's videos on YouTube where you can watch. They don't look so therapeutic to me because he's like hitting people and stuff, but like bending them over wooden planks. But the ethos of the culture for a very long time was, Iyengar was the Harvard of yoga. This is the therapeutic yoga because we use props. And it's like, sure, yeah, maybe it is, a little more accessible because we're bringing the floor up to you with a block, or, we're doing restorative poses with blankets and bolsters. But again, it still comes down to the message. And if you know, bought in hook, line, and sinker to Iyengar yoga, you were told yoga is all you need. So I think it's a cultural, problem and an education problem that needs to be changed, really, in the dialogue. That you know it, yeah, like that's really what, I mean, because even like Deskachar style yoga, Vini yoga is the most therapeutic of the 3. But again, like if you're only doing that, we're not walking. Like we used to walk places. That was like what we had to do to get somewhere. So are you going to say like all you need is Vini yoga and you don't ever need to walk?
Well, this sounds like what one of
Right.
the points you make about your new book is you talk about how to apply a skills-based approach instead of a lineage-based approach. Is that sort of
Yes.
what you're talking about there? Is rather than getting caught up in just one way of doing things that you need to kind of look more from a functional level, are you able to do and interact in
Right.
the world in a certain way?
Yeah. And I think when you start to teach skills, movement skills rather than poses, um, then you empower your students to have more critical thinking skills. So, as somebody, I, really tried on and tried out all the many different movement methodologies, and that's what they are, they're methods. So, when you study, say, ballet or martial arts or yoga or Pilates, right, you're learning a sort of curated group of movements that usually one person, even in dance, same, you study
Hmm.
Martha Graham, it's one way of dancing. And so, yeah, I think if we can sort of uh, deconstruct, most of them tend to be somewhat patriarchal, right? It's usually one man who comes up with a method, whether it's gyrotonic and it's Julia Horvath, or it's Joseph and it's Pilates, or it's, there are some methods of movement, that's, you know, like Martha Graham, but even dancers knew that they couldn't just dance or they would fall apart. So,
Hmm.
I think I'm a huge fan of Matthew Remski, who really talks about, um, you know, dismantling the sort of cult like into the bubbles. So, yeah, sorry, I'm sure I went off on a tangent, but yeah, I think that I forgot your original question. Sorry.
No, I
I
think
just
you
started
answered
going
that. That
on
was
and
kind of looking at
on. Okay.
from the lineage perspective versus more of almost a functional
Yes.
perspective around movement. Well, and from that, do you feel that the unique needs of the student have changed over the years from where maybe it originated to where we are now, especially in the Western culture?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when I think about just, I was born in 1972, and how much movement I did as a child in the 70s. Like I can't remember when Atari came on the scene, but I was not doing Atari as much as I, yeah, it was just a different, I think that the yoga practice, they're also like, I mean, it wasn't until the 70s that people started running, like Nike shoes came on the scene. Wasn't until probably early 80s that aerobics came on the scene. So people weren't even really exercising because there was, they might play golf or tennis. I remember that was like a thing, if you,
Hmm.
belonged somewhere and you would go in the summer and swim, and then like maybe your mom or dad played golf or tennis, and then racquetball was a thing in the 80s. So yeah, I do think that, and I think the yoga was very different. So I went on a vacation with my husband. I think we were in Greece, and I took a yoga class, and I was like, oh wow, this is awesome. Like, this is like the yoga class I took in 1994 when I was in college, or the yoga class I took in, 2006. So I do think, because people are moving less, the yoga became their workout, whereas back in the day, so to speak, it was just like something weird that you would try and see if you liked, but it was like very counterculture.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, yeah.
And from the lack of movement that kind of happens now more commonly, and especially in Western society, that are you finding that it's hard for them to even sometimes go right into a practice like yoga, then that they sometimes need to build up the incremental ability to do some of the different postures, the different positions, so that that's why you're sort of looking at blending these different concepts together so that when people do go into yoga class, then their body's prepared and ready to be able to do it.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of, I might have a student who comes to my yoga class that can do every single yoga asana because that's what they've been working on. But then I ask them to do, like a rolling pattern um, and they can't
Hmm.
roll, like they can't move in the transverse plane. The only way they can move in the transverse plane is like sitting on the floor, grabbing a body part and twisting. But
Yeah.
or they have no spinal flexion at all, because yoga has almost no, yoga asana has. So, and again, educating that like these are human movements you need. I hope that when you bend over and pick something up off the floor, you're not so delicate that you have to be in a neutral pelvis and spine every time. Like your spine should be able to tolerate the load of rounding to pick your sock up off the floor. And it won't be able to if you are only training in a neutral pelvis and neutral spine,
Yeah.
which or you can't do, say, just like hug your knees to your chest and rock back and forth rolling, because you're only doing back bends and sun salutations.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, and the rolling patterns are great. I think those are some of those really telltale ones where you realize you can't actually move in a certain position, that you're having to like literally throw your body into a position to create those movements where it just feels like I can't access those muscles to do the movement I'm being asked to move.
Yeah, I think if we can educate when we teach that you're only good at the things you do,
Hmm.
um, because and so like you might be really good at bird dog, and bird dog is hard, like being on your hands and knees and balancing opposite, or even like beast, where you're on your hands and knees and you hover your knees and you lift like opposite hand, opposite foot. But yeah, you can't flex your spine, you can't rotate your spine, you can only do that, but like you're an amazing Olympic weightlifter.
Hmm.
So yeah, I love encouraging, because I do teach so much continuing ed for yoga teachers, encouraging them to really explore moving all your parts in all the ways. And I also talk a lot about doing the things that you suck at. So I think one of the best ways to prevent injury is you do a whole bunch of different things and you're not really good at any of them, that good at any of them, sort of like a jack of all trades, master of none. At least for me and for most like of my clients, that tends to work, where when you really deep dive into one thing, just like athletes do, unless you have the time and the money to, to
Hmm.
do all the things that allow you to do that one thing really well, which most people do not, it's really a challenge to stay injury free.
Yeah, well, and people like doing the stuff that they're good at, so
Yes.
it wouldn't be a very popular class probably to do, come and do stuff you don't like to do, but probably a really important one.
Well, and I actually, like, I'll say, welcome to my class. We're going to do all of the things that you kind of suck at, but that you're not doing in the rest of your life. But I promise I'll make it fun. We'll laugh. So yeah, and it
Nice.
won't be all of that, but there will be some things that,
Yeah,
where
and
you're
I think
like,
that's a great
oh,
idea. It'd be really
yeah.
good to have a functional movement assessment periodically in people's regular classes, just to go through a
Yes.
range of different types of movements and strengthening and just see, almost on a scale of 1 to 5, what are you doing really well at and where do you need to have the support? That would be a great
Yeah.
way to really assess where you are in your practice and when you need to really fine tune it. Someone got to figure
Yeah.
it out.
Well, and I think that's exactly what happens when you take a private Pilates session, a private personal training session, you work with a
Hmm.
physical therapist. And so that's the other thing I really encourage my students and teachers who take continuing ed with me. And that's where I've learned the most, is I've continuously taken either private personal training or private, one-on-one sessions ever since I've been a teacher. I think it's just like if you're a psychotherapist, you're required to
Hmm.
go to psychotherapy. And I think it should be the same for movement instructors, that you should be required to take private sessions yourself, and also teach private sessions. So you understand. I think it's really hard for teachers to understand how truly different everyone is when you don't teach private sessions.
Yeah, I agree. Well, in that mentorship you get with a teacher, that shines a light on the chinks in the armor, right? That sometimes you just won't
Yes.
know.
Yeah, and the phones are great now, right? Because you can just like take a
Yeah,
quick video and be like, okay, let's watch this, see what happens.
yeah. People are like, "Oh my gosh."
Yes.
Trina, I wanted to ask you too about posture. What's your perspective on posture? I know it's individual for people, but
Yeah.
is there a perfect posture? Is there specific exercises that you think are really beneficial to help support better posture? And when does someone know that their posture may need some tweaking and some alignment?
Right. Yeah. So whenever I get asked, what's the best way to stand or how should I sit? Or, I always say, which, is very well known, your next position is your best position. We're not meant to be in one
Hmm.
static position for long periods of time. And if you are, you're going to feel it. Um, but in regards to individuals, again, this is why, say in a group class, I don't think there's any, you know, one cue for a specific movement, because say you're in mountain pose, which is Tadasana, which is just you're standing.
Hmm.
Somebody like me who is a gymnast, major rib flare, anterior tilt, it's sort of trained into you. That's what gymnasts do when they finish their tumbling routine,
Yeah.
is that's the pose. But then, somebody else can have the opposite, a very sunken chest, a posterior tilt. I think when any of those um, positions that you're in most of the time that aren't the rib cage over the pelvis, are either causing pain, or preventing you from being able to, you know, do whatever things you want to do. So, if you're so collapsed that then, there's no way you'll ever be able to flex your shoulder because it's not a shoulder thing, it's also a thoracic rib cage thing,
Yeah.
then yeah, it could be really beneficial to do some pulling exercises and strengthen your upper back and the backs of your shoulders. I don't like to put out the message of like we're a piece of clay and you just mold it and we have a nervous system, and but I have seen those things with my clients and with myself work really well. I mean, for me, doing a lot of um, strength training in spinal flexion and loading in spinal flexion helped me get out of that, big back bend shape where it's like, oh, why am I, like right at that, mid back, like, why is that bugging me? And like, oh, because I'm like hinging there and bracing there. And, you know, so I do think all of that can be really useful. And I think though I've been working on changing my language around it. So rather than like old school upper cross syndrome and all those types of terms, um, just, making it more about like, oh, you want to be able to reach to the top shelf, right? Like let's do a little more of, strengthening your upper back and your shoulders and putting you in some positions that you probably aren't in because you're a chef and you're doing this all day long.
Hmm.
um, to again bring in that uh, variability of movement
Right.
and
Which sounds
loading
like
and
at first you need to be aware of where's the more common position that you end up with so that you can then
yes.
from there almost reverse engineer it to figure out what you need to do to start to create the balance in it.
Yeah, and I think a huge thing is so many people try to fix their posture, like, somebody tells them that their ribs are flaring out and so they're constantly holding their ribs down, as opposed to just like do some hollow body holds and get stronger there, because it doesn't make sense to like pull your shoulders back and down 24 hours a day or stuck your stomach. Like, no, like just be stronger in those areas so then it becomes your new natural posture.
Hmm. It's so true because I mean you hear that one all the time, straighten up, pull your shoulder back. But the problem is with a lot of it is if you've been in a habituated posture for a long time, then how the nervous system works too is certain muscles then are always firing. And if certain muscles are
Yes.
firing all the time, they're reciprocally inhibiting opposites. So it's sort
Right.
of like then certain ones are always going to be weak. So that whole system has to be retrained a little bit. You have to
Yeah.
release over firing ones, strengthen back up the weak ones, and then they keep each other in
Yeah.
check again.
Yes, exactly. And just because it's feels tight and it's gripping doesn't mean it's weak. A lot of time, I mean, doesn't. Sorry. So, like, if you're gripping at the mid back and you're always there, it doesn't mean that you're strong in
Mhm.
in that area. It actually could mean that you're weak, and that's why you're gripping there all the time. So it's not just like, oh, you're in this back bend, we'll strengthen your abs, or oh, you're collapsed, let's strengthen your back. Um,
Mhm.
it would be nice if it was that simple, but it's not.
Well, good testament again to why it's always nice if people can get some one-on-one with
Yes,
a practitioner or therapist or something to be able to shine a light on those chinks in the armor again, because it's hard for people to know, and a lot of people are
yeah,
so not even aware of their body and the movements and what their body feels like. It's hard for them to figure it out themselves. They do usually need somebody to help figure it out with them.
absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Trina, I want to be considerate of time here, but I'm also wondering I'm asking everybody in this series, from the years of being in the business of yoga and practicing yoga, all the different trainings you've had, has there been any specific teachings or insights that you've had that have really, these aha moments that sometimes inspire you to create some change? What has it been for you? Has there been anything that's been these big awakening moments for you over the years that really resonated and shifted your perspective?
Oh gosh, there's so many that, yeah, so many, because I think every step along the way, there were aha moments. Because when you start out, like when I first started, all I knew was the things that I was learning in my 200-hour training, which were phenomenal. Like I still use things that I learned, 12 years ago today.
Hmm.
Um, but back then, that was all I knew. I didn't know any of the other things that I've learned since then. And I mean, I think that's what I love about, I worked in the corporate world for a very long time. And most of the time, I had jobs where I would learn the job. And then I would be really bored and very depressed. And if I learn too much, then my boss would be nervous, because then I might take my boss's job. And so being a teacher means that I always get to be a student. And being like just a never ending student, everything I learn better when I start teaching it.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think my aha, I don't know if it's the same as what you're asking, but I didn't, I'm 47, and I didn't start this career until about 10, or 11 years ago. Um, but it's the career I'm going to stick with because I get to keep learning. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, I think the aha is always that no matter what I continue to do, um, I I'm just still always learning and unlearning.
Yeah, that's probably
Yeah,
even
like
more unlearning than learning a lot
unlearning.
of time.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, thinking back to things that I taught, say, 8 years ago, and how I don't teach those things anymore. And, things that I'm teaching now, I won't be teaching in a few years. So, yeah, I think that's the aha, that's most important, is just sort of, we're all doing the best we can. We're learning, the most recent things that, are being discovered now. And, but being okay with knowing that it's going to change.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a really important one. So, I mean, a lot of times things we learn, we tend to get attached to, and then that actually creates more limitation in how we see things versus being able to maintain an open mind. That's part of the beauty of having a student mindset. You just always want to learn, and then if you can learn and certain things now feel different or don't work the same way, that you're okay to let those things go. So yeah, I think that's a really, really important one. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Trina, thanks so much for sharing your time and your wisdom with us. Where is the best place for people to learn more about you? What's the best platform to send them to?
Definitely my website. So it's my name, trinaaltman.com, and everything is there. All of my online continuing education courses and classes, my in-person continuing education workshops and events, and then, social media links to Instagram, Facebook. You can contact me there. So yeah.
Wonderful. I'll make sure all of that's in the show notes. And yeah, I've gone to your website too, and you've got a ton of great free info for people too. I think even like
Yeah.
exercises to do and different things that that round out one's practice as well, I think. So
Yeah, definitely. I love creating content and sharing it. So if you're on my email list, you get it. Share a lot to Instagram as well.
wonderful. I will make sure all that's there. And once again, Trina, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jason.
You're welcome. That's a wrap.
That was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.